In this presentation, the focus is on restorative justice. My group members and I will be describing the type of group, outlining and stating the history, the purpose, and the components of the group, and we'll be discussing the clinical application and provide a short demonstration of restorative justice. Restorative justice is a problem-solving approach to crime which involves the parties themselves and the community in an active relationship with statutory agencies. It is a process whereby parties with a stake in a specific offense resolve collectively how to deal with the aftermath of the offense and the implications of the future. Watchell describes restorative justice as originating as a mediation or reconciliation for victims and offenders of criminal acts in the 1970s.
Restorative justice is an alternative model or paradigm that is a victim-oriented method that deals with the effects or ramifications of crime and wrongdoing by attempting to resolve conflicts, righting wrongs, and healing and repairing the pain, trauma, and destruction caused by an offense by involving the victim, the offender, and the community. In other words, restorative justice's sole aim and purpose is for persons to share their encounter or experience of what happened, discuss who was affected by the criminal act or offense, and to generate a consensus for what the offender can do to mend the damage caused by the offense. The National Association of Social Workers located in Washington, D.C. defines restorative justice as a non-adversarial approach that is typically monitored by a trained practitioner or professional who aims to provide some form of justice to the affected victim, the offender, and the community, all of whom have been harmed by a felony or crime or some other form of misconduct and wrongdoing. As far as the history of restorative justice is concerned, some researchers or scholars claim that it started during the second half of the 20th century, whilst others have stated the origin of this term dates as far back as the 19th century, particularly from a Christian perspective. The principles, practices, and values of restorative justice dates back centuries ago to many ancient indigenous practices and cultures, which can range, for example, from Native American to First Nations peoples of Canada, from the African culture to the Asian culture, some Hebrew, some Celtic, and even Arab. Supported by other organizations in Canada, restorative justice had spread to North America and Europe through the 1980s and 1990s under various names like victim-offender mediation and victim-offender dialogue. Modern restorative justice was shaped by the main founders John Braithwaite, Howard Zaria, and Mark Braithwaite, and was expanded to include communities and family members of victims or offenders for a collaborative process.
In Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, in 1974, a probation officer named Mark Yancey arranged for two teenagers to meet tete-a-tete or face-to-face with their 22 victims following a series of vandalism. They agreed at the end of this mediation session to compensate for the damages and pay restitution. Out of this generated the first victim-offender reconciliation. So this approach was backed and supported by both the local probation department and the Mennonite Central Committee of Ontario, Canada. During the 1970s, modern usage of the term restorative justice was introduced or reintroduced by Albert Eglash. Eglash came up with three different approaches to justice: retributive justice, distributive justice, and restorative justice. Retributive justice involves justice that is based on punishment. Distributive justice involves therapeutic treatment of offenders only, and restorative justice is based on restitution with input from victims and offenders.
We follow the restorative justice timeline from 1974, where the first reconciliation program VOP occurred in Kitchener, Ontario. In 1977, Albert Eglash reintroduced the term restorative justice, and in 1978, the first US VOP occurred in Elkhart, Indiana. In New Zealand, in 1989, we witnessed the passing of the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act in response to the pressure from Maori activists. And in 1992, we see the first Western institutional use of circles, which has been deemed a traditional healing method used by the First Nation and Indigenous people of Canada. In 1995, we crossed continents and head to South Africa, where a Truth and Reconciliation Committee was employed to allocate responsibility for and to heal the catastrophic effects of apartheid. In 2002, we see that the United Nations endorses the use of restorative justice, and in 2006, we moved from the use of zero tolerance policy approach in the Oakland School District to restorative justice.
The Restorative Justice Group consists of a facilitator, the victims and offenders of a criminal or wrongful act, also known as the primary stakeholders, and a larger community like family members or bystanders. Ideally, the aim of restorative justice lies within 4 R's: repair, restore, reconcile, and reintegrate. The process includes using direct communication, where individuals will apologize, use restitution, acknowledgments, and admittance of wrongdoing in order to provide healing to all parties and attempt to reintegrate victims and offenders into the community with or without punishment. Restorative justice also requires that we work not only with the victims and offenders, but with communities. There are 2 types of victims: primary victims, who are the persons that the crime is directly affecting, and secondary victims, which are the persons who are indirectly affected by the crime. So they include family members, neighbors, and friends of both primary victims and offenders.
Victims often feel ignored, neglected, or even abused by the justice process. This results in part from the legal definition of crime, which does not include victims. Victims need answers to questions they have about the offense, why it happened, and what has happened since. They need real information, not speculation or the legally constrained information that comes from a trial or plea agreement. Often, this requires direct or indirect access to offenders who hold this information. Victims often feel like control has been taken away from them by the offense control over their property, their body, their emotions, their dreams. Involvement in their own case as it goes through a justice process can be an important way to return a sense of empowerment to them. Restitution by offenders is often important to victims, sometimes because of the actual losses, but just as importantly because of the symbolic statement implied. When an offender makes an effort to make right the harm, even if only partially, it is a way of saying, I am taking responsibility and you are not to blame. Restorative justice has brought an awareness of the limits and negative byproducts of punishment. It has been argued that punishment is not real accountability. Real accountability involves facing up to what one has done. It means encouraging offenders to understand the impact of their behavior, the harm they have done, and to take steps to put things right as much as possible. Offenders need from justice accountability that addresses the resulting harms, encourages empathy and responsibility, and transforms shame. Offenders need encouragement to personal transformation, including healing for the harms that contributed to offending behavior, opportunities for treatment for addictions and/or other problems, enhancement of personal competencies, as well as encouragement and support for integration into the community, and for some, at least temporary restraint. The main categories of programs include victim offender mediation, community and family group conferencing, circle sentencing, peacemaking circles, and reparative probation and community boards and panels. Victim offender mediation meetings are organized to give offenders a chance to take active steps to make voluntary reparation to their victims. Such reparations extends much further than financial compensation. It includes an apology and an explanation of how the crime came about, and the offender has to listen to the victim's own story and respond to it. The exchange can be therapeutic for victims and usually has a visible impact upon the offenders face the reality of what they have done. Offenders can restore their own reputations to some extent through reparation and can be better prepared for reintegration into mainstream society by having resolved their guilt in this way. Reparation may take the form of financial payments, work for the victim, work for a community cause selected by the victim, specific undertakings, example counseling, or a mixture of these.
There are two types of mediation techniques, namely direct and indirect mediation. In direct mediation, we employ a face-to-face meeting between the victim and offender, and it is normally facilitated by one or more mediators. While in indirect, it's less personal. It does not allow the victim's more emotional needs to be satisfied, as well as it's less effective in breaking down stereotypes and increasing understanding. More so, it may be less influential in reforming offenders. Benefits of victim-offender mediation. There are three basic requirements that must be met before victim-offender mediation can be used. 1. The offender must accept or not deny responsibility for the crime. 2. Both the offender and the victim must be willing to participate. And 3. Both the victim and the offender must consider it safe to be involved in the process. Victim-offender mediation ensures that victims' needs are more comprehensively served, including the need to be consulted. It ensures that victim and offender can see each other as persons rather than stereotypes. And it provides a positive source of motivation for reform to occur. According to Johnson 2013, the primary objectives of restorative justice are 1. Firstly, to attend fully to the victim's material, financial, and emotional needs. 2. To prevent reoffending by reintegrating offenders into the society and community. And 3. To enable offenders to assume active responsibility for their actions. The primary objectives also create a working community that supports the rehabilitation of offenders and victims, is active in preventing crime, and to provide a means of avoiding escalation of legal justice and the associated costs and delay, and finally, provides a means of avoiding escalation of legal justice and the associated costs and delays.
As stated on this slide, the cornerstone of the restorative justice process is built on four main concepts. These are inclusion, encounter, amend, and reintegration. In the restorative system, inclusion encourages the full cooperation of all stakeholders in the court proceedings and justice process and assumes that each participant will pursue their own interests while being flexible enough to accept new approaches appropriate to their specific situations. And what this means is that the victim and the offender may not be the only persons involved in the process, but also community members, if they have the perception that these members of the community may have been affected by the offense as well. As it relates to finding a flexible approach that is specific to the particular situation, what this simply means is, for example, if burglary or theft was the offense carried out, that maybe financial compensation may be most appropriate as opposed to traditional imprisonment. The slide goes on to say that there are at least 4 ways in which the victims can be involved in the process. This includes one, information, which pertains to the status of the case, whether or not the person is going to be prosecuted or not, and about particular services and rights that the victim may have in this particular situation. The second one is presence, and this pertains to allowing the victim to attend the court proceedings, and this is based on the premise that the person will not jeopardize the defendant's rights to a fair trial. The third one is really the victim impact statement, and the victim's impact statement is really about the physical, the mental, the emotional, social, or economic harm caused by the crime or by the offense committed. And then the last one is really the legal standing, where the victims are given legal rights to pursue restoration during the criminal proceedings, and also be involved in things such as investigations, plea bargaining, sentencing, and post-sentencing procedures. We now have encounter as one of the key components of the restorative justice process. And this process has 5 interlaced components, one being meeting. This is basically where the offender, the victim, and all persons invested in the offense has a face-to-face meeting. We also have narrative, which is a subjective rather than an objective process, where each party explains their stories and describe what had happened to them and how it has affected them, but also their view on the crime and its consequences. We then have the emotional aspect of it, which is where each party basically explains their emotions behind what had happened. And we also have understanding, which really stems from the meeting, the narrative, and the emotional portion of this process. And it's really to humanize the victim to the offender and to change their attitudes about criminal behavior, basically. Then we have an agreement, which is basically all parties involved coming up with an agreement on how to move forward. We then have amends, which basically seeks to repair all harm that was done. And amends can be achieved firstly by making an apology, which can take either a verbal or a written approach. We also have change behavior, and change behavior is basically where the offender agrees to engage or disengage from criminal acts. It sometimes even involves taking the offender out of their environment and placing them in a better environment with hopes of them learning new behaviors. We also have generosity, and sometimes generosity goes beyond, just balancing the scale, but this is where the offender agrees to provide acts or services that has absolutely nothing to do with the crime. And lastly, we have restitution. Restitution should always be paid first to those who are directly affected by the crime. This can be done by replacing property that was damaged or providing some type of financial relief to those who was affected by the crime. We lastly have reintegration as one of the key components of restorative justice, and reintegration serves both the offender and the victim. Firstly, the victim, because sometimes they can feel stigmatized by the criminal act committed against them. Say, for example, rape. Women are sometimes or constantly blamed when they are victims of rape based upon what they were wearing, where they were, all of these things. So in the reintegration process, what is done is really, you can really provide them with some type of psychiatric assistance or psychiatric help that will allow them to, free themselves of feeling as though they were the cause of the crime. And then we have reintegration for the offender. And sometimes when being an offender, you can eventually be separated from the community and sometimes lose all resources to be a functioning member of society. So the reintegration process really helps them to achieve or to gain assets for them to be contributing members of society then. Sometimes a job, housing, or even counseling for being ostracized. As the slide says, one of the central purposes of the restorative justice process is to empower the victims. In many instances where criminal acts are committed against someone, they tend to feel some level of powerlessness. This is particularly in instances of rape and burglary, as I would have mentioned before. Not being able to stop an act from being committed against you really leave someone feeling as though they don't have control over their lives. So the restorative justice process, allowing the victims to explain their needs and being a part of the resolution process, restores power and also helps with a healthier transition and reintegration into society. Another aspect or another purpose is repairing the relationship destroyed by the wrongdoing. So the restorative justice process looks both at the offender-victim relationship as well as the offender-community relationship. And what they do is try to repair, any harm caused by the offender, with hopes that there would be fewer or lesser criminal acts carried out against the community or against individuals in the community in the future. Lastly, we're going to look at denouncing certain behaviors as one of the core purposes and goals of the restorative justice process, as well as ensuring that responsibility be taken by all parties involved, but particularly the guilty party. So the latter is basically self-explanatory, and what it seeks to do is allow the offender to take responsibility for their actions and for the consequences of their actions, with the hopes of them refraining from engaging in criminal acts within the future. Denouncing certain behaviors looks at changing behavioral patterns both within the victim and the offender alike. It looks at identifying certain patterns within the offender's environment that would encourage them or that would lead them to engaging in criminal behavior, and attempt to develop mechanisms that would decrease the short factors, really in hopes of them engaging in pro-social behaviors. As it relates to the victim, what the restorative justice process looks at is thought patterns that may be harmful to the victim. As I said prior, sometimes victims of crimes tend to blame themselves. So what the restorative justice process tries to do is allow the victim to develop coping mechanisms that would change those harmful or negative processes or negative thought processes into positive ones that would allow or would help with the reintegration into the community and society at large. Lastly, we're going to look at denouncing certain behaviors as one of the core purposes and goals of the restorative justice process, as well as ensuring that responsibility be taken.
Robert, Michelle's neighbor for 5 years, broke into her house one night and stole her wedding ring, appliances from her kitchen, and petty cash she found in her purse. He was caught by the neighborhood police patrol. This was his first offense, and the community agreed to try restorative justice approach to restore harmony to the neighborhood. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the session was facilitated online and included a workshop on restorative justice.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are here to discuss the burglary that took place on October 31st, 2020 at Michelle's home. We do not intend to pass blame, judgment, or enforce any punishment. However, we do hope to be able to understand the reasons why Robert broke into Michelle's home and to begin the healing process for the community to move forward. Robert, would you like to tell us what happened?
Sure. So it was around 9 p.m. that night, and I was just walking around the neighborhood, and I realized that Michelle's car was not in the driveway. So I decided to walk around the house and see if a window or any doors was open, and the back door was. So I went in and I started ravishing through the house, and I found a few valuables, being some jewelry, a necklace, a ring, and some appliances. I would have packed away the jewelry and had, her microwave under my arm leaving the house. And upon one hour, that's when I bumped up the community police.
Michelle, would you like to let us know how you felt about the incident?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I noticed that went missing was my wedding ring, you know. I was devastated. I was completely devastated. You know, that's a symbol of like my marriage and love and everything, you know. And you know, I no longer have that. So that really took a toll on me. Also, like the appliances that were, you know, taken, the microwave, the blender, the toaster. Like these are all things that I use on a daily basis. You know, I have a 2-month-old that needs, you know, to eat food that's been blended, and now it's even more difficult to do that for them. And I understand that, you know, it's COVID times and we're all struggling and stuff, but there's really no excuse, you know. The petty cash that was taken, you know, I don't really care about that, you know, but I just think it was really, you know, unfair and unreasonable to, you know, have to have all my stuff, you know, of meaning, you know, taken from me. So, yeah.
And Robert, could you share with Michelle why exactly you chose to break into a house and take those items?
Well, as she said, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected, all of us. And as you may or may not have known, I lost my job at the beginning of and family. I am a single parent, have children to feed as well. A lot of my utilities have been cut. One of the very things that we need at this moment is internet services, and I am without that. So I really needed, to reconnect that service for my. At that time I feel as though I didn't have a choice but to break into a house, but to steal some of those items to provide for my family.
Okay, thank you for sharing, Robert. Michelle, is there anything you want to say to Robert at this point in time?
I mean, now that I know that, you know, you've been through what you've been through, had a hard time, need internet access for your children, I could, you know, empathize with you, but I still don't think, you know, it was warranted, you know, going into someone else's house during these times where we're all struggling and stealing, you know. So, but I see where I understand what you're going through.
And what would you like to see come out of this meeting today?
Well, I think once Robert understands how it has affected me, and well, I understand how, you know, why he would want to do this. I think we can all benefit from this, you know, positive situation, and I feel like we've achieved that understanding and clarity that we probably both needed to, you know, grow past this.
So thank you for empathizing with me. I know that there is nothing that I can do at the moment because I am still without. As soon as I regain employment, I promise that I try my best to repurchase all the items that I would have taken from you and your family.
Michelle and Robert, I would just like to thank you for giving the restorative justice approach a go in attempting to solve the problem that would have arisen because of Robert's theft from your household. I thank you for trusting the process. Each of you were respectful, you listened, you shared your views very clearly, and I hope moving forward you all are able to repair and reintegrate whatever relationship you all have.
Yeah, thank you.